When you're in an encounter, it can be really deflating to finally strike a creature that you've been trying to hit for a while, and then you find out that they have an immunity or they have a resistance to whatever effect you're trying to do. And it can also be pretty elating when you finally hit that same creature and then you find out that they have a weakness to something that you can do. It really kind of brings your combat to life and makes the individual creatures different, and will also make your party determine specific tactics in order to try to overcome those immunities, those resistances, and try to key in on those weaknesses. Recall knowledge, esoteric knowledge, there are various ways that you can find these things out rather than trial and error. Or if you don't have that, you can just go ahead and do trial and error. But regardless, immunities, resistances, and weaknesses can seem like a lot, but they're really not that hard. So let's go ahead and take a look at them. So my name is Don. I'm trying to be the Sly Strategist, and let's go ahead and get into it. So we'll go ahead and start with immunity. Now, immunity confers complete protection against a specific type of damage, making you pretty much impervious to any harm of that specific type. There could be fire, it could be poison, it could be mental. There are a bunch of different things it could be, and there's a list of damage types on page 409 of the player core. And the immunity will also be in the description for the player or the creature stat block for that particular effect or attack. Now, for conditions or types of effect to which you have an immunity, you would be unaffected by the damage from that specific condition or any effect falling under that category. Now, you can still be targeted, so while abilities can still target you, even if they include effects or conditions you're immune to, you would just simply disregard that specific effect or condition that is granted by your immunity. Immunity can also extend to effects with specific traits, such as death effects, poison, disease. Those are the examples from the book. If an effect possesses both a trait and deals a certain type of damage, and the example they have is a lightning bolt spell, well, that lightning bolt spell is going to have the electricity trait, and immunity would apply to the effect tied to the trait, not just the damage, simply because the spell itself has the electricity trait. Now, there are some complex interactions that can happen with immunity exceptions, and in certain cases, complex effects may have components that affect you even if you are immune to one of the effect's traits. Now, an example that they give is a spell dealing both fire and acid damage could still inflict acid damage even if you have immunity to fire. Now, Player Core does list a couple specific immunity categories that can be a little bit troublesome. Let's cover those a little bit. And the first one is going to be immunity to critical hits. Now, immunity to critical hits alters the effect of critical hits on the immune creature. When a creature that is immune to critical hits is critically hit by a strike or any attack that would deal damage, it incurs the normal damage instead of the usual double damage. Now, immunity to critical hits does not grant immunity to other critical success effects of actions, and that includes the critical specialization effects or additional damage from the deadly trait. And a good example for this one that I found was Intimidating Strike. A critical hit would not do the double damage, but the target would still be frightened too. Now, it is explicitly written in the rules that in specific instances, the game master might decide that certain added effects associated with the critical hits wouldn't apply if that effect would not make sense in that situation. So, once again, GM discretion. Now, another specific immunity they mention is immunity to non-lethal. Now, immunity to the non-lethal trait grants protection against all damage from attacks and effects carrying the non-lethal trait. This immunity applies regardless of the specific damage associated with the non-lethal attack. So even if it was bludgeoning or slashing or piercing or another damage type, the immunity would still apply because you are trying to do it non-lethally. Now, they did have an example, and the example was a typical construct exhibits immunity to non-lethal attacks. So regardless of the amount of force you apply, non-lethal attacks will not inflict any damage on the construct. Now, you can take a penalty, and in this case, it would be a -2 circumstance penalty, and that's on page 282, but it can be taken to remove the non-lethal trait from an attack. And then there are certain abilities that may provide unarmed attacks with the non-lethal trait, offering alternatives as opposed to having to take that penalty if you happen to have that certain ability. And the last Specific example they have of immunities is temporary immunity. So certain effects can give you temporary immunity, rendering you impervious to the same effect for a very specific duration. Now, during the period of temporary immunity, repeated tries to apply the same effect will have no impact. And the source of the effect causing temporary immunity isn't particularly relevant unless it is explicitly stated in the source for that effect otherwise. So, temporary immunity applies regardless of who created the effect. And the example they give is a really good one, and it's the blindness spell. So, the blindness spell grants temporary immunity, stating the target is temporarily immune to blindness for 1 minute. If another creature attempts to cast blindness and makes it within the 1 minute time frame, the spell will have no effect due to that temporary immunity that's explicitly stated in the spell. And another thing they mention is ongoing effects and temporary immunity. So, temporary immunity does not prevent or terminate ongoing effects caused by the source of that particular immunity. And we'll give a good example just to kind of detangle that sentence a little bit, and that would be the frightened condition. If an ability gives a player character the frightened condition, and then you gain subsequently a temporary immunity to being frightened, you do not immediately lose the frightened condition because you received it before you got that immunity. The temporary immunity only ensures that you won't become frightened again if targeted by that ability again before the immunity expires. Now, the next big category here to talk about is weaknesses, which is usually a player character's favorite thing, unless the player character is the one with a weakness. Now, if you possess a weakness to a specific type of damage or damage from a particular source, that type of damage really becomes extra potent against you. That extra effectiveness is reflected by increasing the damage taken by whatever the value of the weakness is. And a good example of this, and it's from the book, is if you received 2d6 fire damage and you have a weakness of 5 to fire, then the actual damage taken would be the 2d6 roll plus an additional fire damage, simply because you have that weakness of 5 to fire. Now, there are some other impacts of these specific weaknesses, and that would be weaknesses to damage types like fire, cold, things along those nature. They result in additional damage when exposed to those elements. And they had a pretty extreme case here, but it's definitely possible in cases where weakness is to something unconventional. And the example they give is water. Damage equal to the weakness value is incurred upon initial contact or initial exposure. So, taking the example of the water, if you were to remain in that water or cannot get out, if you're in encounter mode, you might take damage continually per round or another period that is written in the effect description or as determined by your GM. And if you're in exploration or downtime, you would look for that in the effect description, or the GM might have to determine that themselves. Now, there are combined weaknesses, and when faced with multiple weaknesses for the same instance that a player character or a creature received the damage, only the highest applicable weakness applies. So this scenario typically arises when a creature is vulnerable to both a type of damage and a specific material or trait, and that might be piercing, slashing, or bludgeoning damage, and a specific material like silver or cold iron. And they do have an example in the book of why this would come up. That would be a creature that might be weak to both cold iron and slashing. And then let's go ahead and move on to resistance. So resistance mitigates the impact of specific types of damage by reducing the damage by whatever the listed resistance value is. So the reduction is applied for each instance of damage to a minimum damage of 0. So you can't actually heal because of a resistance and get negative numbers and thereby give yourself more hit points. Now, there are versatile resistances, and resistances can extend to specific combinations of damage types or other traits, and that might put a little nuance into the defensive nature against certain threats. For example, resistance to non-magical bludgeoning damage basically says that you have reduced damage from non-magical bludgeoning attacks, but not from magical sources like a +1 mace, which is a magical weapon that does bludgeoning damage. Now, some resistances may have exceptions. For instance, resistance 10 to physical damage, except silver, reduces physical damage by 10, except when it's inflicted by a silver weapon. However, there are times when you have multiple resistances. So when you face multiple types of resistance for the same damage instance, only the highest applicable resistance value is considered, and that's pretty similar to how the weakness mechanism worked. The example here that I can think of would be a resistance 10 to physical damage, and resistance 5 to silver would still only reduce physical damage by 10, and the 5 would just kind of be ignored. And then we have a not fun case for a player character, but it is possible to possess resistance to all damage types. When confronted with an attack dealing multiple damage types and having resistance to all damage, the resistance is applied separately to each damage type. An example scenario here would be with a resistance 5 to all damage, an attack dealing 7 slashing damage and 4 fire damage would result in the slashing damage reduced to 2, and the fire damage would be completely negated. Now, I hope you like this guide to immunity, weakness, and resistance. It seems like it's a lot and there's a lot of interactions, a lot of things to keep track of, but it's really not that hard once you understand the basics for it and just kind of know some of the exceptions, but the exceptions are actually described really well in Player Core. I do hope you liked this video, and if you did, feel free to like, subscribe, or hit that notification bell. But whatever you do, I hope you have a great day and happy adventuring. Thanks.